Good afternoon, evening, morning, as applicable. And my name's Ashley Hibbard. I'm a research associate with the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence, and a very warm welcome to you all for this, our final session of our Lent book club, looking at the book Unspeakable, Preaching and Trauma-Informed Theology by Dr. Sarah Travis, who's joined by Respondent, Dr. David Toombs. After I introduce them, Sarah will have 10 or 15 minutes to introduce the book. I'll then invite David to respond for 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll have the remainder of our time for open discussion, questions for author and respondent, time for them to interact with each other. Looking forward to this. As a matter of housekeeping, if I could just ask everyone to make sure you're muted for the presentations and then unmute for the discussion, that'd be most appreciated. So as to our presenters today, Dr. Sarah Travis is the Assistant Professor of Preaching, Worship, and Christian Ministry at Knox College, University of Toronto. Sarah is an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church in Canada and currently serves as part-time minister at Norval Presbyterian Church in Norval, Ontario. Her primary areas of research and teaching are preaching, worship, and the practice of ministry. From decolonizing worship practices to trauma-informed preaching, Sarah's published several books aimed at facilitating a conversation among Christians about topics that matter for the church today. She's a 2023 Calvin Institute of Christian Worship Teacher Scholar Grant recipient, exploring how playful theologies can enhance the worship and self-identity of very small congregations. I may need to pick your brain later. Dr. David Toombs is a lay Anglican theologian and the Howard Patterson Chair, Professor of Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago, New Zealand. His work draws on liberation and contextual theologies to address public issues in transformative ways. His publications include Latin American Liberation Theology, Brill 2002, Explorations in Reconciliation, edited with Joseph Lichty with Routledge, When Did We See You Naked? Jesus as Victim of Sexual Abuse, co-edited with Jamie Reeves and Rocio Figueroa with SCM, and most recently, The Crucifixion of Jesus, Torture, Sexual Abuse, and the Scandal of the Cross with Routledge just last year. Delighted to have these accomplished scholars with us today. Sarah, I'll turn the first part of our time over to you.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be here. And I'm so excited about what David has to say, because I've been looking at some of his work, and it's quite remarkable and has very strong ties to my own work. So what a great conversation to be part of. I'm just going to switch to my notes, so I won't be able to see you, but shout at me if you need anything. I just want to begin by talking a little bit about this book, how this book came to be. It was written before COVID, and although the editing process was finished during COVID, I think it might have been a slightly different book if it had been written a couple of years later. So that's something interesting to think about as you consider the book. But it really arose out of my own experience of being voiceless. I came across scriptures that spoke of hope and restoration, and I simply could not imagine that kind of hope or restoration for some of the situations that I was seeing in our world. There are cities that have been devastated by war and by natural disaster, and it was hard to imagine that they could ever rise again. And so I wondered, where is the hope? Where do we find hope when our reality is trauma? The larger story of how this book came to be written was my own personal struggle with trauma, and that had to do, as I write in the book, it had to do with the death of my son Sam about 15 years ago, when he was 3 years old after a long illness. And my own experience of being a pastor, being a minister who had preached resurrection every week, and then to encounter a situation where death was my reality. And although I had this hope in me, how hard it was to be in worship and to be surrounded by good news that didn't seem to leave enough space for me. And so that's kind of how this book got started. It does not say everything. It's very much an introductory book. And its goal was to think about how to deal with traumatic texts and experiences in preaching. So this involves naming trauma in a very fulsome way without re-traumatizing people, which is much harder than it sounds. What I want to do with this time that I have is not so much to summarize the book. I want to pick out some themes that I think are slightly underdeveloped in the book, that I think are really interesting for a conversation. So the first has to do with embodiment. Theology begins with a wound. Our questioning and imagining about God begins where there is pain and discomfort. Theology begins with a wound. This splendid image from Mary McClintock Fulkerson assumes that the wound is also a place of healing. Where there is a wound, there is an opportunity to see God's action, to look for God's presence. Where there is a wound, there is the beginning of a conversation. So we could begin this conversation today by talking about the Bible or about words, because it is a book about preaching. But I want to begin somewhere else. I want to begin with the body. I am a good Presbyterian, and thus I associate preaching much more with the brain and mind than with the body. The Reformed tradition has often abandoned emotion in favor of intellect. And yet preaching begins and rests in the body, the Word made flesh. In a book called My Grandmother's Hands, Resma Manikem writes, quote, "The body is where we live. It's where we fear, hope, and react. It's where we constrict and relax. And what the body most cares about are safety and survival. When something happens to the body that is too much, too fast, or too soon, it overwhelms the body and can create trauma. Contrary to what many people believe, trauma is not primarily an emotional response. Trauma always happens in the body. It is a spontaneous protective mechanism used by the body to stop or thwart further or future potential damage." End quote. So when we talk about preaching and trauma, we begin with our own trauma and the way we hold it in our bodies. If we're to talk about preaching, we are talking about an embodied exercise. We preach with our bodies, not only with our mouths and throats and tongues making sounds, but also with our arms, whether they are still or raised in benediction. Also with our legs, whether we shift nervously or pace confidently. Also with our hearts and brains, which carry our own trauma. I'm making an assumption that all of us carry trauma, our own and others. But there can be no comparing. We cannot decide which traumas are greater or heavier than others. Instead, there's a recognition that we hold them, each of us in different ways. We come to this task of preaching as full participants in a created world which is full of bad behavior and natural disaster, which means we are immersed in trauma, body and mind. Even now, whatever time of day it is for you, as we come to this conversation, we come carrying the traumas that have formed us in negative and positive ways. You might want to stop and think about your own sense of trauma. That trauma resides somewhere in your body, and perhaps you can feel it and perhaps you cannot. Maybe in the pit of your stomach or in the tension in your neck. It is a good practice as human beings to be aware of how much trauma resides in the body. For preachers, it is a responsibility. So I invite you to take time later on when you are alone to consider where your trauma resides in your own body. How does it become evident in your tension or your posture? What do you carry into the pulpit with you? Let's also think about those who listen to preaching. They bring with them all their trauma, which will manifest itself somewhere in their bodies. Their trauma will affect what and how they hear. It will be evident in their posture as they rise to sing or stoop to pray. It will affect their ability to use their hands for the good of others. It will determine the words that come out of their mouths. They will bear the weight in their feet. Sorrow and trauma sit in our pews. We might not think about listening to preaching as an embodied practice, but it is, because listeners are whole beings with gurgling stomachs and sore knees. And it will be a strong practice for us to pause and think and to wonder what trauma is being carried around by those who listen to our preaching. How will it affect their ability to hear good news? What would they interject into the conversation that you began in your sermon? And how does trauma shape the manner in which they will participate in the sermon? I just want to read a quote from a homiletician named Caroline Lewis. And she writes that preaching is not about the words that one speaks. As a result, one's body is connected with that power and authority of which the preacher must constantly be aware. Our bodies have the potential to comfort and console, to nurture and protect, but also the possibility of wielding power that brings about pain, suffering, and even death. Bodies that tower, bodies that yell, bodies that shake their fists and point and pin down are not those that seek to present an interpretive point, but those that intend to coerce and subjugate into belief. A preacher has to consider what and how her body is communicating with as much care as she considers her words and her tone. Preaching is not simply about content, but about embodied content. Preaching is a necessary act for understanding the theological promise of the incarnation. The word becomes flesh again in proclamation, incarnated anew in the body of the preacher and the body of the congregation. To take the incarnation seriously means that we have to take our bodies seriously. So just a couple of thoughts about what it means to take our bodies seriously as preachers. One is to be aware of trauma and where it resides in our own bodies. Another is to care for our own bodies and our minds and our spirits. It means being gentle with the bodies of others. We live in a world where people frequently traumatize others. To be gentle with other bodies is to treat them with respect and dignity, understanding that others carry trauma and being as generous as we can. And finally, it's important that we make space for the bodies of others. And that's about being inclusive and accessible. There's a couple of other areas that I don't have time to get into now, but scriptural interpretation, I think, is an area where I wish that I had more room in this book to write, because it's so important for preaching, at least from my world. And again, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Reformed person. And so scripture plays very heavily into my understanding of preaching. So I think there's a lot more to be said on that topic. And finally, where I don't get to in this book, I talk about post-traumatic growth a bit, but I don't talk about my own healing. And I just want to take a minute and say that I have been through trauma. That trauma still resides in me, and yet I have found a space of grace where I'm able to carry it. And I think that speaks to the resilience of faith and the action of God. And that I do believe that it is possible to heal from trauma. I think the scars always remain, but healing is possible. And that, I hope, was communicated clearly in this book. But I just wanted to highlight that reality for me. And with that, I'll pass it back. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was incredibly moving and thoughtful and vulnerable. And what a model of what good preaching is, right there. I'll pass it over without further ado to David.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks very much to you, Sarah. Both thanks for the book, but also thanks for the remarks and the very helpful way that you've introduced the book. And I must say, a very modest way as well. You've talked a little bit about your feelings of areas you could have done even more, but what you've done with this book is a huge gift to the church and to many people. And it's a great privilege for me to have an opportunity to share a few words in response. To do that, let me share my screen, if I can get the technology to cooperate. I think we're all good. Let's see the slideshow. So it's fallen to me to say a few words, which I framed as a conversation with Sarah, and the particular area of conversation that I want to offer is bringing Sarah's work on the unspeakable, preaching and trauma-informed theology with some of the work that I've done over the years on crucifixion, which is a topic that Sarah herself raises in the book. Yes. So there really is so much that could be said in relation to the book, but I'll limit my consideration to this particular interest I have in terms of speaking of the cross and speaking of resurrection. And particularly, I want to talk about ways that might be mindful of Jesus' own experience in crucifixion of sexual abuse. And I realize that the belief that Jesus experienced sexual abuse as part of crucifixion is quite confronting, and would therefore want to offer that as a trigger warning at this stage. If you've not come across this idea before, be aware that it is a confronting idea. Do look after yourselves and do look after others as we have the Q&A part. But I think it's important, and I think it speaks to issues of healing that Sarah touched on towards the end of her remarks there. So I will say a little bit about why I think that sexual abuse should be seen as part of Jesus's experience, and also why I think Sarah's work encourages us to take seriously this question as to how recognizing Jesus' experience of sexual abuse can inform an understanding of both cross and resurrection. One of the passages that touches on this relates to her awareness and sensitivity to the empire and imperial and colonial context that Jesus lived in. As you see here, she points, I'm working from the Kindle edition. We haven't had the paper version arrive in New Zealand yet, so working from Kindle, location 943, she points in this passage to the trauma as part of a lived history in the lives of New Testament characters. As she says, Jesus' death on the cross is in one sense a narrative of political trauma, a shameful and humiliating end. Those are her own words. But she then cites two other influential scholars who both also speak on the trauma of the cross. First, Jennifer Baldwin, who says, at the very epicenter of Christian faith, community and practice stands the utter traumatization of Jesus the Christ. And that's footnote 113. And to this, Sarah adds the words of Deborah Van Dusen Hunsinger. Traumatic loss lies at the very heart of the Christian imagination. In fact, the book by Sarah is in the same series as the book by Jennifer, and it gets referenced very helpfully throughout her work, and it certainly made me buy Jennifer's book as well, and I'd recommend that book as well. If you've not already read it, it's extremely helpful. Deborah Van Dusen Hunsinger's work is very important in the field. She's another scholar that Sarah draws on in different places. And then a third scholar who comes up quite a lot is Shelley Rambo, the well-known trauma theologian. But leaving some of the bibliographic detail aside, let me return to Sarah's own argument. Sarah has lots of powerful passages on the cross and its trauma. And many of these, as you see on screen here, identify the cross as an instrument of imperial violence. I think this is really important context to understand crucifixion, and also more specifically to understand the sexual violence of crucifixion. It makes sense within a political context, and in particular, an imperial colonial context, or to phrase that slightly differently, in a context of differences in power, and where one party has a vested interest in projecting and exerting their power. The cross, Sarah writes, announces death as a real thing. There is no sugarcoating the violence and suffering that Jesus experienced on the cross. It proclaims the human capacity to harm others. I think this captures it really well. It proclaims, the cross, proclaims the human capacity to harm others. Jesus was hung on an imperial cross. In another passage which really jumped out for me, Sarah describes the cross as a form of tortuous execution. And I think this is also very important, recognizing crucifixion as a form of execution, but also as a form of torture, and execution through torture. Following the pretense of a trial that functioned more as a form of social humiliation and performance of the power of civil authority in which Jesus was given the death penalty, Jesus was mocked and physically assaulted, publicly and torturously executed. Now, I don't have enough time to comment all the detail, but I really like and admire the way that, without saying much about it, some key themes just get woven in to the description and analysis. So just draw your attention to performance of the power of civil authority. It packs so much into just a very short expression without laboring it. I think it's absolutely right to see the crucifixion as a performance of the power of a civil, in this case, imperial authority, really key to understanding what crucifixion meant and its message in the ancient world. Another source that Sarah draws upon, and one which is well known in particular for its analysis of the cross, is Serene Jones, especially her work Trauma and Grace in 2009. Jones describes her long-standing interest in preaching on the cross, especially preaching in ways that speak to the plight of trauma survivors, in ways that do not glorify violence. Jones says, "For several years now, I've been asking how the church might more effectively minister to people who live through an event of overwhelming violence and continue to suffer from its emotional cognitive effects. I've been particularly intrigued with the challenge of preaching about the cross to such people. Not only is there a question as to which story of the cross we might tell, but another important issue is also at stake. How can ministers craft sermons that speak to the plight of trauma survivors without re-traumatizing them? How do we make theological sense of what happened on the cross in a way that speaks to the experience of traumatized victims without glorifying violence?" And I think that's such a good question, and I think Sarah's book is such a helpful way of approaching it. I'm particularly interested in Serene Jones, not least because in October 2018, at the height of the controversy around the confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh as a proposed Supreme Court judge, and all the controversy around allegations of a historical sexual assault, which had been raised by Christine Blasey Ford, Jones tweeted a screenshot of a study that looked at responses to whether or not accusations of multiple sexual abuses against a candidate for office would make a difference to different demographic groups. So this study with the statistics had already happened. It's not particular or a response to Brett Kavanaugh, but to the more generic issue as to how different groups respond to allegations of multiple sexual abuse. And what Jones draws attention here is that actually white evangelical Protestant score badly in terms of their response to this. They don't seem to prioritize it as a concern. And Jones argues that pastors need to speak openly and consistently against sexual assault. And one of the resources she identifies for that is speaking about Jesus' own experience of sexual abuse. And she encourages people to have a look at the paper by David Toombs. She actually provides a screenshot of it. Here she cites the passage where it writes, "Confronting the possibility of sexual abuse and the passion of Christ could provide practical help to contemporary victims of torture and sexual abuse. Recognition of sexual abuse and the treatment of Jesus could bring a liberating and healing message to the women, children, and men of Latin America and elsewhere who have been abused. The acceptance that even Jesus may have suffered evil in this way can give new dignity and self-respect to those who continue to struggle with the stigma and other consequences of sexual abuse. A God who through Christ is to be identified with the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned is also to be identified with those suffering abuse and torture in the modern world." And Jones says, well, imagine how different the national debate would be if sexual abuse of Christ was commonly understood as part of the Passion narrative and used to underscore the severity and horror of contemporary sexual assaults. Now, the article to which Jones speaks there was published in 1999, and it came out of a paper presented at the Society of Biblical Literature International Conference the previous July. And in that paper, the argument is made that recent documentations of torture in Latin American military regimes can illuminate neglected aspects of Christ's passion presented in the Gospels. And most importantly, this involves recognition that crucifixion was a form of torture and that it served a wider purpose than execution. That is, it served the state's purpose of terrorizing its perceived or real enemies. And one issue in the horror of Christ's crucifixion, the degree of sexual abuse that was involved, seems to have been completely neglected in Christian tradition. And that was the focus of the paper. As said, it was published the following year in Union Seminary Quarterly Review. Serene Jones is president of Union Seminary in New York, so has a particular connection with the journal. And that's available through Columbia University Creative Commons if anyone wants to download the journal and have a look at it. It is effectively open access now. Let me just say a little bit about the key arguments for those who might not be familiar with it. It makes the argument that all four Gospels talk about Jesus being stripped at the cross, and the implication is that Jesus was crucified in a state of enforced nudity. But two of the Gospels have a report of Jesus being repeatedly stripped prior to that. Both Mark and Matthew talk about the stripping of Jesus in the Praetorium. I've put Matthew's passage up on the screen here, and we'll just take you through that. So here's the passage. Here are the two explicit strippings that with careful reading come out more prominently in verse 28, and when Jesus is stripped of his own clothes for the scarlet robe to be put on him, and then after mocking him, they strip him again of the scarlet robe, put his own clothes back on him. So two strippings are explicitly attested. In addition, we see in verse 26 that Jesus was flogged, almost certainly naked before being flogged, or if not naked, the flogging itself would almost certainly rip apart his clothes. Then in the final verse, verse 31, there's a reference to him being led away to be crucified. And although that's not a statement of Jesus being stripped in these verses, it is a signal of stripping which is to come. So we have in just 6 verses, 4 references, 2 explicit, 1 implicit, and 1 a reference of a stripping about to come, to the stripping of Jesus as part of the traumatic experience of crucifixion. A further part of this, which often gets missed, is we're explicitly told how many soldiers are involved in this. And the answer is a whole cohort. Now, my experience working with groups is often groups are quite vague on how many soldiers were in a cohort. So even if they notice this number, they don't really have a clear sense of, well, how many soldiers were involved. So it's important to say that if we take this part of the passage at face value, and I see no reason not to take it at face value, not least because Matthew has signaled that it was the whole cohort, and I think that's not using the term cohort in a generic way, but in a more detailed way, the whole cohort. We're thinking of 500 soldiers here. It's an overwhelming display of imperial presence, of imperial performance. So something very significant is going on. It's organized. The soldiers have been gathered. They've not just come together. It's a really very threatening statement. 20 years later, in 2019, my colleague Jamie Reeves at Sarum College, Salisbury, and I revisited this in the light of discussions which have been prompted around Me Too, and published this journal. Again, it's this article, again, it's open access in the journal, International Journal of Public Theology, #MeTooJesus, naming Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse. I also worked with colleagues in South Africa at the Ujima Centre at University of KwaZulu-Natal to develop a contextual Bible study that would lead a group through thinking about the passage and the troubling messages it has on the presence and purpose of the stripping of Jesus. And that Bible study is also available for anyone who wants it. Then, as Ashley mentioned very kindly in her introduction, 3 of us, Jamie, myself, and our colleague in Auckland, Rocio Figueroa, put together this book, When Did We See You Naked? Jesus as a Victim of Sexual Abuse, bringing together 20 international scholars to reflect on and write about the stripping of Jesus in ways that gave attention to the stripping and raised the question of sexual abuse. And one of the really interesting things was how strongly the contributors of the book felt about the significance of this incident. I did a podcast with the Shiloh Project podcast, the broadcaster Rosie Dawson, and I had a conversation around what first brought me to looking at this aspect of Jesus's experience, and that's available if you like listening. And then last Easter, a Brazilian journalist, Marvio dos Anjos, published a piece in the Brazilian Sao Paulo magazine on understanding Jesus's experience. He's titled it here, Body, Cross, and Abuse, exploring it. And one of the interesting responses that elicited in quite lively debate on social media was then First Lady Michelle Bolsonaro, who condemned the article, the whole newspaper, in some ways, but described this as both insanity and Christophobia, hatred of Christ. I think that's a very unfair accusation, and I was in the process of writing this book, the Routledge book that Ashley also mentioned, The Crucifixion of Jesus, Torture, Sexual Abuse, and the Scandal of the Cross. So I was able to include Bolsonaro's criticism of the idea in chapter 5 of the book. And then finally, and just published, also open access, produced by a team mainly in New Zealand, but published through the Shiloh Project in the UK, the Toolkit Accompanying Survivors of Sexual Harm, a toolkit designed for churches who want to offer better responses to survivors of sexual harm. This toolkit also has a Bible study that looks at the Matthew passage with attention to the stripping and sexual abuse. So these are my reasons for bringing the question of sexual abuse as part of crucifixion and the cross to Sarah, and saying how much I appreciate her work, interested in any thoughts she or others as part of this event might have in terms of thinking of sexual abuse and the cross. But let me end with a comment from somebody who wrote to me after reading the 2 books, the SCM and the Routledge book, with a letter which speaks more to the resurrection aspect of this. The final chapter in the Routledge book turns to resurrection, and in response to the tweets by Bolsonaro that I mentioned, I look at how and why understanding the sexual abuse that Jesus experienced is not a form of hatred towards Jesus, but is an appropriate and important topic to consider. Now, I'm not going to say much about that chapter. You're welcome to grab a copy of the book and read it to yourself. But I will end with this letter I received, because I think the words of the speaker, a woman, speak to resurrection, and hence my interest in hearing more from Sarah if she wants to comment on this. In particular, ways of preaching on how sexual abuse, crucifixion, and resurrection can be done in ways that is both mindful to Jesus' experiencing and not traumatizing, but helpful for the church. So the letter said, I have just read your book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, as well as the chapter from When Did We See You Naked? I wanted to let you know how deeply this has helped me. I've been healing from my own childhood events that were traumatic, and I have never been able to feel innocent or understood. I have held shame for so long. I am in my 40s now. Reading what you wrote about Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse and realizing that he is blameless even though he was violated in this way has healed a deep part of me almost suddenly. Some areas that I've been working on in therapy for years have been clarified, and it's like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle has fitted into place. I haven't stopped crying at how much I know he understands me as well as what happened to him. I can't adequately express my gratitude to you here for your work. I meant to end exactly at this point, but I didn't introduce this letter by saying the writer has, of course, given me permission to share it. So let me end by just saying she very generously gave permission to share it. And at this point, I'll bring my presentation to an end. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, what an incredible presentation. I've been thinking. I was sharing with David just before we all joined that I was in a study on Thursday that was picking up some of these themes and presenting some of this material to hearers for the first time. And what's been going round in my head for the last few days is the passage in Isaiah that says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And if we see Jesus as victim of sexual violence, that opens a new way in which he joins us in our human suffering. Anyway, you're not here to listen to me preach, for which you're all very thankful. And I'd like to open it up to questions for Sarah or David or both. I'd love to have this be a live conversation. Please feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask. If you'd prefer to put them in the chat, I'm happy to ask them for you if that's a preference.
I just want to comment, if I can, and say thank you to David for that presentation. I wasn't familiar with your work, and I wasn't familiar with that concept of Jesus and sexual abuse, but how profound and how important. And as Ashley is saying, how liberating if Jesus knows that. If Jesus understands that, that's so liberating. But as you were talking, of course, the question that I'm asking is, how do we preach that? Because it's not going to sound like good news to people who hear that for the first time. We have enough trouble with understanding the crucifixion and understanding atonement and exactly what happened there. But for me, it all comes back to that concept of power and empire, and how empire has destroyed bodies, not only through war and that kind of violence, but also through sexual abuse. And that's something we don't talk about. Sexual abuse is something we don't talk about in preaching, even though Scripture gives us so many opportunities to do that. So I just want to recognize what an important yet challenging thing this is. And I need to put a lot more thought into how that could be communicated in a sermon. Because, you know, I think about what my little church would do if I said that on Friday, next Friday. If I were to preach that, they would not know what to do with themselves. So it occurs to me that if we're going to preach about this, it needs to be part of a much larger focus in our preaching, that we need to prepare people to hear this, because they need to. And I'm so grateful for your work. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Really appreciate that. And what you say makes perfect sense. This is not going, well, it's not an easy issue, and it's not going to become any easier. And therefore finding ways to do this in, you know, as you put it in your way, ways that deal with trauma in ways which are not re-traumatizing is going to be really, really challenging. So yes, I absolutely hear what you're saying. Thank you.
Sarah, you've written 2 really helpful posts for our blog, one on the Christmas story and the Paris massacre of the innocents and the trauma in that, and also about the Easter story and Mark's version of it, where it ends so suddenly in trauma, which I'd never thought of. And they're 2 really good ways of beginning to bring the idea of trauma into preaching. I wonder if you had any other suggestions, because it's so important, but it's something that has to be done so carefully.
Well, I think that we don't have to look far to find trauma in the lives of our listeners and in ourselves. And I taught a course last year, and I had one student tell me that it wasn't a helpful course because they would never preach about trauma. And I thought, oh dear, what are you preaching on then? Because it seems to me that trauma is at the heart of so many of our texts. And it's at the heart of the experience that we're all living. I mean, I said that I wrote this book after or before COVID. And I had the experience of talking to a minister who had been told by their church leadership not to mention COVID in a sermon because people were tired of it. And so, I mean, in terms of ideas of where does trauma meet preaching, I mean, we don't have to look very far. I have students, a couple of my students are located in the United States, and they are, you know, they're dealing with the issue of gun violence. And I mean, such a national trauma, an intergenerational trauma, a political trauma. It's every kind of trauma. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Something that I find in very commonly in church circles I end up in is a sort of, I don't know if I came up with this phrase or if I got it from somewhere else, but a sort of emotional prosperity theology. You know, of course we don't worship Jesus for the stuff he gives us, but we worship Jesus because he'll make us feel better. And how can we use, because that makes for such a shallow faith, and then the people, I hear it from the loudest, I see it, a desperately shallow faith. How can we actually use trauma-informed preaching to start working upstream against that inclination?
It's so true. There's a Jesus loves me and therefore I will be happy. Jesus loves me and therefore all is well. I mean, we encounter this every time we ask someone, how are you? And they say, I'm fine. I'm fine. And I think there's a sense in which that's the only Christian response that's faithful, is to say, I'm fine. And I think we need to start unraveling those conversations at a pastoral level and making it okay not to be fine. Because, and we like to finish sermons that way. We like to tie them up with a nice tidy bow and say all of this happened, but it's all fine. The resurrection happened. What trauma? And so allowing people to stay with it, I think, helps a lot, to give permission to not be okay. But no, I love that expression about emotional prosperity, because how true is that? It's so true.
What's at the risk of being that person who asks too many questions, what's the line between re-traumatizing and making people face hard things?
And that line's going to be different for everybody, which makes preaching extremely difficult. I had a student preach a sermon a couple of weeks ago. He'd obviously got confused between preaching about trauma and trauma-sensitive sermons, because he named the trauma, but he named it so vibrantly and so vividly that it felt like I was being hit over the head repeatedly. And it was like, whoa, too much trauma. I think it's a very fine line, because we need to name it, and sometimes just naming it will re-traumatize. So I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that our preaching will occasionally cause harm. Whether we want it to or not, there will be people in our midst for whom it is too much. And again, preaching shouldn't ever happen in a vacuum. So that needs to be part of our pastoral care and part of our pastoral conversations, so that we're aware when people have had too much, and we can tend to them before and after our sermon, so that the sermon always, I really believe that it should be part of an ongoing conversation. The sermon never stands alone, or shouldn't stand alone.
It's really helpful. Thank you.
Can I just address a point to David? I think your understanding that Jesus might have suffered sexual abuse is extremely helpful, but I can understand how someone who has suffered sexual abuse could either find it very helpful or actually very unhelpful, along the lines of whether you believe God suffers. And if you believe God suffers, then it actually can be very helpful to you to think of God suffering. But if you don't believe God suffers, then to be told that God's suffering with you, well, no, I don't want that. I want a God who's more than that. So can you sort of say anything about how you might respond to someone who actually finds it, the idea that Jesus suffered sexual abuse actually shatters their illusion of what Jesus is like and a Jesus they perhaps need, whether we think it's a wrong understanding or not?
Thanks, Peter. That's a great way of asking the question. And I think it's a sensitive area, and it would probably not be a single thing that one could say, but exploring why it's important to that person that God does not suffer, and not judging that view. I mean, I must say that doesn't seem to be the message of crucifixion to me. That's not what I would take from crucifixion, that God does not suffer. But if that's something that's important to somebody, then my question would be to hear more about that. Why is that important? Why is that comforting? Why is that significant? And why is that challenged by seeing Jesus being mistreated in this way? I certainly wouldn't want to be telling the person they're wrong. Their view and their faith is what it is, but I'd be open to sharing why I wouldn't see it that way. I suppose in the back of my mind would be a distinction between what I think the text is saying, and I think the text is accurately representing history here. I don't entertain the possibility that the text has inserted suggestions of sexual abuse which would not have been historical. I think they're in the text because that was part of the reality of crucifixion. So I would sort of see the text and the history coming together clearly here. But of course, that's then separate to, well, what is the theological significance of this? That's an open question. I've got my views on that, but somebody else could see a different theological understanding of it. I think in my mind also would be that the vast majority of people that I've talked to on this have sometimes had negative reactions to the idea when they've heard the idea from others, or they've just heard the sort of bare bones headlines of the idea. So Michelle Bolsonaro, to treat her tweet charitably, she didn't read the article. She didn't want to seriously engage. She's responded just to the idea, and I can understand that. The vast majority of people who more seriously engage with the thinking and why that thinking is being offered, I think are generally thoughtful and genuinely appreciative. I will, if I may, just offer a slight gloss that I probably wouldn't say to the person I'm talking to, but in my own mind, I would be aware of, that for me, it's no longer the case that Jesus may have been sexually abused. I find the presentation in Matthew's gospel compelling on this. I don't see that there's room to insert a maybe, or at least not in a helpful way. I think it's there and it's clear. Where there is a maybe is what else might have happened in addition to that. I absolutely recognize there's a maybe there. And in the Routledge book, the first area I go to is for stripping, and I make the case that is clear, and it's appropriate to name that as sexual abuse, and therefore appropriate to say Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, not just might have been. Then the following chapter is what else might have happened in the Praetorium, and that is a might have happened. We don't know there in the same way we know for the stripping. What else might have happened on the cross? Again, we don't know. There's evidence that can be looked at, which is suggestive. I think we need to bear in mind that for many victims, survivors of sexual abuse, the stripping is the first step in further sexual abuse. It's particularly for victims of torture and political prisoners, the stripping is not the last thing that's done to them. It's an early stage, but we don't know. That's my point. So all of that would be going through my mind in terms of talking to somebody. I wouldn't want to be telling them that they have their theology wrong. I don't think that's appropriate, but I would be very open to exploring the different views we have on this. And I think you've named it exactly right. I would be coming at it with the belief that God can suffer. We would probably just disagree on that. And the challenge would therefore be to hear each other with respect on that theological difference.
That's really helpful, David. Thank you.
I was really struck by your reading of the passage, David. Particularly, so I'm a prison chaplain, and in the context I work in, there are very occasionally times when someone in custody needs to change clothing and might refuse to do so, and that process would then happen with the use of force, which in the circumstances would be deemed necessary, reasonable and proportionate force would be seen to meet that criteria, but I'm aware might be experienced by the person in custody as a violation. And I wondered really what your kind of reflection would be on perhaps those sort of questions of interpretation, on kind of lived experience maybe versus I'm trying to find the way to articulate it, but there would perhaps be kind of, two accounts of what happened in a given circumstance from two or more angles, and kind of maybe just I wondered if you could comment on that. And I think that for me it feels really relevant because I'm chaplain to prisoners and to staff as well, so I kind of work for the system, in the system, with people who feel sometimes oppressed by the system. So yeah, if you could comment on that, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, and be very happy to comment on it. So first of all, to draw a distinction that there may be appropriate, necessary requirements for change of clothing, or typically in a conflict situation when a prisoner is first taken into a facility, there's a security measure which involves stripping the person coming in for weapons or anything else that might be coming into the facility. Now, at least in principle, that's a legitimate measure. Of course, it's possible that the person being stripped will experience it as a violation. I can completely understand that, and it's appropriate for you as a chaplain in that facility to be aware of those two very different interpretations. But at least in principle, even force stripping in some circumstances may be legitimate. It seems to me, at least. But that's not to say that force stripping can't be used, even if there's legitimate rationale for it, to add to the embarrassment and humiliation. So in my previous work, I spent 13 years working in Ireland, and one of the issues on which there was most bitter hatred of prison conditions was force stripping. And force stripping was hated because it was at least perceived and experienced, I think, as an intentional humiliation. It was done to add to the humiliation. And that's entirely possible as well, that it can be used for that. It can be used as a way to exert power and to perform power. So one of the examples I give in the book is the experience at Abu Ghraib, where it was standard procedure to strip prisoners as they came into Abu Ghraib. This was the well-known prison in Iraq during the conflict in Iraq, particularly around 2003 to 2004 and onwards. And at least potentially that initial stripping might have a valid justification. But stripping was then used fairly routinely as a so-called standard operating procedure against prisoners in Abu Ghraib. And it's really hard to see the legitimate purpose of those strippings. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that signals that that stripping was being used to humiliate, to demean, to degrade, and to exert power over people. Now, I would imagine in your work, it's entirely possible that you have two different interpretations on any particular event, and certainly I wouldn't be in a position to say which was right, and I imagine it would be often very, very difficult for you to say which is right. But it is recognizing that those differences do exist, and in at least some situations the stripping is not used for a legitimate and appropriate purpose, and or it's done in a way that deliberately enhances the demeaning of the prisoner being stripped. And in those circumstances, it seems to me appropriate to think of it in terms of sexual abuse. So a rather long answer, and let me conclude by just saying I looked at the case of the Hackney schoolgirl who was stripped in school by police, and it seemed to me that that was a case where there might have been a case under certain conditions for a strip search to be used, but actually the strip search that was used was entirely inappropriate, and both the school and I think the police came to understand that. So it's all sorts of issues about how this is done. It's not just for subjective interpretation, but subjective interpretations are really important as well. And blessings in the job you do. I'm sure it's not an easy job for you to be doing.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very helpful and nuanced response.
Friends, I'm cognizant of how very far past time we are and want to respect your time. I'll leave the room open for a few minutes past our close if anyone would like to, or have bandwidth to stay. As we've done with our other Lent Book Club lectures, let me conclude with this prayer. Restless with grief and fear, the abandoned turn to you in every hour of trial. Lord, deliver us. God most holy and most strong, whose wisdom is the cross of Christ, free us from all that keeps us from you. Relieve the misery of the anxious and the ashamed, and fill us with the hope of peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Let me thank you for your attendance at this, and for some of you, I know others of our Lent book clubs, this has been a very fun series. Please watch our social media for more upcoming events. Consider joining us this June in Bristol or online for our research conference, Let Justice Roll, Scripture and Power in Palestine, in collaboration with our friends at Christ at the Checkpoint. Good night, or afternoon, or morning, and may God bless you. Go in peace.